Let's move on to other world news now. We're just days before weapons had been set to force silence in the war in Ukraine for a Victory Day ceasefire, and Russia is showing no signs of halting attacks. At least 28 people have been killed by Russian drone and missile strikes carried out overnight and later on Tuesday in Ukraine. The attacks came just hours before a unilateral ceasefire declared by Ukraine was due to come into force. Well, France 24's International Affairs Editor Philip Turle is in the studio with me to break this down further for us. Philip, what can you tell us?
Well, I can tell you, first of all, that as far as the Ukrainian ceasefire, which began at midnight last night, is concerned, they're already accusing the Russians of violating it. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha has accused Russia of violating the ceasefire, saying it was nothing to do with diplomacy. There have been attacks against Zaporizhzhia and also Kharkiv, earlier attacks just before the ceasefire came in and killed 28 people. So the whole point of this is that Russia has decided to declare a ceasefire to coincide with the 81st anniversary of its victory over Nazi Germany in the Second World War. That's on the 8th and 9th of May. Ukraine has jumped the gun in this, saying, well, it's going to impose a ceasefire as from midnight last night. They're both unilateral ceasefires, no consultation between two sides. It really a test, I think, by the Ukrainians to show their country is willing to start an immediate and lasting ceasefire, and that they're going to pin any violations on the Russians, which is what they're going to do right now. Volodymyr Zelensky, announcing this ceasefire, said that the regime of silence would start at 0 hours on the night of May the 5th to May the 6th, and Ukraine will act symmetrically according to Russian actions. That basically means that, well, if the Russians violate the ceasefire, that opens the door to Ukraine violating the ceasefire that Russia wants to impose beginning just in a few days, which leads one to believe that, unfortunately, this ceasefire won't hold. When you ask most people in Ukraine whether it will hold, they say no, they don't believe it will, because there have been ceasefires like this in the past. There was one more recently over the Orthodox Easter period that wasn't respected either. So a lot of suspicion on both sides about the fact that, yes, there are ceasefires announced, but when the push comes to shove, it's pretty sure they won't be respected.
Well, Philip, the Kremlin is showing signs of nervousness ahead of Victory Day, and the Russian authorities say a grand military parade on Red Square is to be scaled back now. What are they nervous about?
Well, they're nervous about quite a few things. I think the first one is that one of the reasons they've declared this ceasefire is because they don't want Ukraine sending drones, for example, into Moscow that could cause trouble on Victory Day. The Russian Defense Ministry has been pretty outspoken about its warning, saying if the Kiev regime attempts to implement its criminal plans, as it describes them, to disrupt the celebration, the Russian armed forces will launch a retaliatory massive missile strike on the center of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. This is pretty much echoing what Donald Trump said about Iran and obliterating the Iranian regime and also civilization in Iran. That is tantamount to a war crime. But the Russians say that any attempt by Ukraine to disrupt the celebrations taking place in Red Square will be met with a very harsh response. There is, I think, worry in Russia about the fact that the regime feels more under threat right now. As I said, there is more ability of Ukraine to fire drones into Russia. It's been pinpointing oil depots, missile depots as well. There is also deemed to be a threat from within in Russia for personal security around President Vladimir Putin. He spends more time in a bunker. They're more worried about the fact he could be under threat, especially as several generals have been assassinated in Russia in recent times. So they're tightening up the security around him. You have to go through 2 checks to see Vladimir Putin, no mobile phones with you and no link to the internet. All those who work with him in close proximity are now no longer allowed to take public transport to go to and from the Kremlin. On top of that, there are economic woes in Russia. Vladimir Putin has already admitted to the fact the economy is struggling, increasing signs of dissent and setbacks on the battlefield. Basically that Ukraine has lost ground. Russia has lost ground in Ukraine in recent weeks. And if that wasn't enough, there has been a fall in support for the Russian president in the opinion polls. There's an opinion poll by an organization called VCIOM, which is an official Russian opinion poll, which shows that the first time since the start of the war in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin's popularity rating has fallen below 70% to now to 65.6%. He was up on 75% back in February. So that is another cause for concern for the Russian leadership.
Well, is Ukraine now feeling emboldened by those military pushbacks that you mentioned there, and also the EU's loan of 90
Well,
billion?
there is good and bad news for Ukraine. First of all, yes, they've increased the number of drones, 7,347 drones launched into Russia in March alone. That was outpacing the Russians. The EU has approved that 90 billion euro loan to the Ukrainians. That's good news for them too. They've taken back territory, 120 square meters. The first time they've managed to do that since 2023. So all of that is good news, but there is still a struggle in Ukraine to get personnel to go to the front. There is still a struggle over the fact that they feel the US has more or less deserted them in favor of the war in Iran right now. So it's not over, and they're still struggling to push back Russians in the long front line, but they are making some kind of small progress at the moment, and that is always good news for the Ukrainians.
Philip, thank you so much for that breakdown. Philip Turle then with our international affairs